through the financial support of viewers like you.
Vernal pools, or spring pools, are temporary ponds that form in the spring from melted snow and rainfall and usually disappear in the summer. We'll find out why they're so important and so vulnerable. Let's take notes. What is a vernal pool and why are they so important to certain species of plant and animal? We'll find out. Our guest is Mike McCarthy. He is director of Shavers Creek Raptor Center, located in Huntington County, about 14 miles south of State College. Thanks for joining us. For those who don't know, vernal means is Latin for spring, but what exactly, Mike, is a vernal pool?
Well, vernal pools are usually small temporary wetlands that are basins in the woods that fill up during the winter months and dry during the summer months.
How do they differ, Mike, physically and biologically from an ordinary pond? Are there major differences?
Mm-hmm. If you are to look at and examine some of the life forms that have evolved over the last tens of thousands of years to breed in these temporary wetlands, you'd see that they're all dependent upon the temporary nature of it. And so they've evolved so that they don't have to compete with fish. And fish obviously need water year-round, so that's one major difference.
This whole issue, vernal pools, studying them, finding out more about them, where they are, is something rather new to Pennsylvania. Why are we suddenly interested in documenting where they are and what habitat can be found in vernal pools in Pennsylvania?
Well, this is such a fascinating habitat, and the flora and fauna that have evolved to use vernal pools are unique. It's an entire ecosystem packaged in this little puddle, if you will. And the scientists have been studying them for a number of years in other states, and only recently in Pennsylvania have they looked at the threats to the vernal pools and some of the species that are vulnerable. There's a species of dragonfly, for example, that exists only in a pond over in not too far away in Center County. It's the only location in the state for this one species of dragonfly, and that's in a vernal pool.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned in the beginning of the program that vernal pools are created when snow melts and because of rainfall. But do vernal pools, is one of the characteristics the fact that they always dry up in the summer? Is that part of what makes it a vernal pool?
Yeah, a majority of these will have been dry in July and August. If there's a really wet year, some of them will remain wet year-round, but for the most part, the vernal pools and the species that depend on them are dependent on the drying up in the summertime.
Mm-hmm. We have a small clip from a videotape that was produced by New England Aquarium that sort of gives those who aren't familiar with it an idea of what a vernal pond is. Maybe you can talk over and tell us what we see here.
Well, here we see the adult spotted salamanders during their spring migration. During the first warm, rainy night, thousands of these amphibians will migrate to these pools and perform their spawning. And the males usually show up first. And here we have, in the summertime, the pool drying up, and snapping turtle here trying to make do with what he can with what's left of that pool in the summertime.
That gave us a bit of an idea of the kinds of species that are dependent upon the vernal pool, but tell us about some others. We have some slides, too, that go with that.
Well, we have all kingdoms of life are represented in these ecosystems. You can find everything from bacteria to algae to protists to amphibians, invertebrates, and reptiles, and the amphibians are the most important aspect of those. There's these little fingernail clams that have evolved for spending time in the summer underneath leaves and then breeding when the rains come back.
But the more important, not the more important, but the ones that are probably more identified with the vernal pond are the wood frogs and the shrimp and a couple of varieties of salamander.
That's right. Here we're looking at an adult wood frog. And they sound like ducks at night.
They do.
When I was teaching high school, I asked my students if they have ever heard any ducks at night in their backyard, and these kids would raise their hands. Here's a pair of females filled with eggs. They're small frogs, brown with the black mask, kind of like a raccoon-type mask on them. And these will also migrate And these are spotted salamanders in what's called a congress. It's more or less a salamander orgy where they get together and spawn all at once. This is the 1-inch long fairy shrimp. This is a female. The dark spot in the middle, you can see that she's loaded up with eggs. And these are related to what we used to think of as sea monkeys that were advertised in comic books. And you just add water and these things develop into a 1-inch long crustacean. Very important to the vernal pool.
Now, the salamanders don't actually live in the vernal pool. They just go there to spawn. Where are they before that, and how important is that vernal pond? Couldn't they go to a regular pond to spawn?
Yeah, the salamanders spend most of their life underground. In fact, those 3 salamanders at the end are called mole salamanders. They're all different types of mole salamanders, and they spend their life underground in using either mole tunnels or shrew tunnels or digging their own tunnels, and they eat invertebrates and worms, and they're very predaceous little critters, very important to the forest.
Why, Mike, is protection of these vernal ponds, or pools rather, in your opinion, so important?
Well, there's such a vast range. There's a whole host of species that depend on these little ponds for their only place to breed. They can't breed anywhere else. They've evolved over the last 20,000 years to use these ponds to breed. And the amphibians, being the most important group to use these, the frogs and salamanders, are the most important by weight in the woods, the most important species and group of animals. And by weight, they weigh more than twice as much. They weigh twice as much as the mammals, and about as the same weight as the birds and found in a section of forest. So that, just by sheer numbers and weight of these amphibians, that can tell you how important they are in keeping the forest ecosystem intact.
Now, how prevalent, Mike, are vernal pools throughout Pennsylvania? Can they be found virtually everywhere?
Well, they're most common in clusters in the glaciated sections of Pennsylvania, up in the northwest and the northeast, in the Pocono region. But they can be found fairly evenly distributed throughout our state forests, and in some cases in people's backyards. And it just needs to be a depression in the woods, and it fills up either through groundwater and with the water table rising in the spring, or they can fill up with runoff in the spring, snow melt.
So if you're out in the woods in the autumn, you may be standing on a vernal pool and have no idea that that's what it is.
That's right, and there are some species like the marble salamander, the last slide we looked at, that comes out in September and October, and they lay their eggs in the bottom of a pool that will be yet to be filled up. They lay their eggs underneath rocks and debris in these pools that will be filled up in the winter or in the spring.
You have actually involved a number of school districts in a number of different counties throughout Pennsylvania in helping to identify vernal pools. Why are you doing that, and what does it take? How do you positively identify a vernal pool?
Well, it's a really unique program to get high school kids out of the classroom into the field and actually doing real-life field studies using the data collection techniques that these teachers will be learning in our workshop that's held at Shavers Creek. Here's a student up to his ankles in water collecting data. The data that they look for are the egg masses of the amphibians, because these amphibians, like the spotted salamander eggs shown here, these egg masses are evidence to show that this is indeed a certifiable vernal pool. There are other techniques we show them, learning how to draw maps, how to make maps so that state officials can go out and find these ponds, especially with the rarer species like the marble salamander.
Once they are identified, Mike, what protection, if any, is afforded to them? Are they protected the way a wetland would be in Pennsylvania?
Well, being a wetland, and if they have the wetland soils, and if they have the hydrology and the specific types of plants, then they are delineated as a wetland, then they do receive protection under state law and under federal law.
And part of what you're doing is determining or trying to find out how prevalent and where exactly they're located in Pennsylvania. How will you use that information ultimately?
Well, the data will be compiled by students and their teachers working very diligently to collect the physical and biological data. And then the data will be turned into to me at Shavers Creek, and I'll review them and make site visits. And if the site is a significant example of this habitat, Pennsylvania Natural Diversity Inventory will be notified so that it can get on the records, and so that that this is the first step in conservation, is to know what we have in Pennsylvania, and then once we know what we have, we can work on trying to protect these unique areas.
I mentioned in the beginning of the program that vernal pools are vulnerable in Pennsylvania. Are we losing vernal pools, and is it similar to the loss of wetlands? Is it a major concern?
The loss of wetlands in the state is serious. The estimate of 1,200 acres of wetlands are lost in Pennsylvania every year. The vernal pools are even more vulnerable because of their temporary nature, that in the spring, the summer, people wouldn't even recognize it as a wetland because the water table is lower and the water is not there at the surface. So that makes them extremely vulnerable to people, like if they wanted to build a garden, or even if the pools are there, they're still vulnerable to people. That some people like to dig out vernal pools, make them deeper so they last throughout the year, and then they add fish to this temporary pond, and so when salamanders go in there and lay eggs, they get eaten by the introduced fish.
So unwittingly, lots of damage is being done.
And that's the importance of this program. It's an awareness, it's an education program to show people that these unique ecosystems exist right in their own backyard and what they can do to protect them.
I would imagine that this would be pretty exciting hands-on kinds of activities for school students.
Yeah, it's received some overwhelming responses by the teachers that have joined this Vernal Pool Education Project through the School of Forest Resources. It was funded through the Department of Environmental Resources through their Environmental Education Grant Program. And through this partnership with the school districts, we're really getting a lot of people excited and getting them out into the field to collect this information and to have the kids really get a sense that they're really doing something locally to protect the environment.
It would seem to me that this is a good example of a symbiotic relationship, though. They're doing something that's fun and worthwhile, and you are in need of this kind of information. Have these students uncovered some significant finds in the counties that are participating?
Yes, there are high school teachers in the Mifflinburg district, and they found a whole cluster of vernal pools that hadn't been recorded before. And also way down in Bedford County, there's a teacher that found a cluster of vernal pools down there in Shellsburg.
We have just a couple of seconds remaining, but what, in your opinion, how optimistic are you of the future of the protection of wetlands?
Well, I'm very optimistic, because once people are aware of just how unique and valuable these habitats are, when people become aware of it, then that's when conservation begins.
And on that note, we're out of time, but thank you very much for being with us. We've been talking about vernal pools. Our guest has been Mike McCarthy, who is a Shavers Creek biologist. For Take Note, I'm Patty Satalia.
Now, the McNeil-Lara News Hour is on Channel 3. Tonight at 9, the testimonies of one liberator and 8 Holocaust survivors who made their homes in Maine following the liberation from Nazi concentration camps. Watch Holocaust Survivors Remember.